This was framed as a question of what is Gov 2.0. I'm already telling you that. I think it's about the power of applying platforms to government. But I'm going to tell you a little bit how I got there and what I think that means. So first off, I want to tell you a little bit about how I think and how, in general, we do what we do at O'Reilly. I call my blog the O'Reilly Radar because it's about the future. And this wonderful quote from William Gibson is very much at the heart of what we do. He said, "The future is here, it's just not evenly distributed yet." And a lot of what I spend my time doing is watching alpha geeks, hackers, innovators, people out on the edges who are often doing things just for fun. And I think about the futures they're already living in. And then I just kind of keep watching as those futures become more and more evenly distributed, more and more real. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit of history of how I got interested in Gov 2.0 and then start saying, okay, what does that tell us about where it's going? So the first person who really put Gov 2.0 on my radar was Carl Malamud. Carl is really the father of this movement in so many ways. Back in 1993, that's pretty darn early in the history of the World Wide Web, he put the SEC online. He got a small planning grant from the National Science Foundation, which he used to actually license the data, which at that point the SEC was licensing to big companies. And he got some servers from Eric Schmidt, who was the chief technology officer at Sun. And he basically put all this data that he'd gotten from the SEC online, and he operated that for something like 2 years, and then he donated it to the federal government. And that was really the first federal government web presence. And Carl's idea was that it really mattered for the public to have access to SEC data. Because right now, it was, at that point, it was only going to bigwigs. Turned out that it really did matter to democratize this data. I was interested enough that when I started to see how social media was starting to change politics, that back in 2004, I ran something called the Digital Democracy Teach-In at our eTech conference, where we were trying to explore, how can this stuff start to be used for political activism. And then I started to see more and more things bubbling up. A group called My Society started in the UK around 1995, a nonprofit that builds useful social apps. Now, the first of these that got my attention was something called They Work For You. And that's a fundamental message that we want to get across to our politicians, that we're paying attention and that they are, in fact, responsible to the people. And tools like They Work For You really had an impact on British politics, and I think they're having a real impact on US politics now as well. But what was really interesting about what Tom Steinberg at My Society did was he also took on the practical business of government. He launched an application called FixMyStreet.com, which was about reporting garbage left on the street, graffiti, street lights that were out. And he just built a lookup table where he figured out Great Britain postcodes or street names and mapped them to the relevant officials and did a lookup and then routed by hook or by crook the message to the appropriate department. This was actually the predecessor of something we'll talk about later, which is 311 services. Also about that same time, Adrian Halavati created the second Google Maps mashup, which was called ChicagoCrime.org, where he was taking Chicago crime data, putting it on a map. He later turned this into a startup called EveryBlock, which he recently sold to, I think, MSNBC. So started with this sort of hacker idea, which really became then a business opportunity. And of course, there are groups like the Sunlight Foundation, which picked up on this transparency idea that Tom had started running with. Actually, they may have started right about the same time. How do we take government data, make it more available to the public so that we can remind our elected officials that they do, in fact, work for us and that we have better oversight? But the real And then Carl Malum and I organized a meeting in 1997 where we started thinking about what did it mean to have open government data. I'm not going to go through the various points we made, but if you Google for open government data principles, you'll see what our thinking was back in 2007. I think it's been an important foundation for some of the work since. And then the next inflection point was the election of Barack Obama. He was clearly using social media to raise money. He put together My Barack Obama as an organizing platform. And I actually wrote a blog post entitled Why I Support Barack Obama, in which I compared him to a startup CEO. And he said, look, he just created one of the most successful startups, Web 2.0 startups in history. He raised hundreds of millions of dollars from the public. He organized that public, and he used it for, to become president of the United States. But I started thinking about all this and saying, well, what does this mean? And how do I take this further? And I did what I often do when I want to learn about something. I bring people together, because it's actually when I don't know things that I'm most interested in starting a conference or other event, or for that matter, publishing a book. I'm not looking for the areas where we know what we're doing. So I said, oh, okay, let me organize a conference, because that's a way of bringing interesting people together, finding out what they're doing, and starting to tell a story about it. And so I organized an event called the Gov 2.0 Summit, and also the Gov 2.0 Expo. The Expo is actually starting is at the end of May 25th to 27th. The second summit is in September, 7th to 9th, both in Washington, D.C. But I started, what does this all mean? And as I started thinking about this story, I went back to the roots of my last big piece of activism around Web 2.0. And I always defined Web 2.0 as the internet as platform. And it occurred to me that this actually applied to government as well. So last year I wrote a number of pieces talking about how platform thinking could be applied to government. Because it struck me that the idea simply that it was enough for government to use social media or adopt cloud computing wasn't actually taking things far enough. It really, the opportunity is for government itself to think like a platform player. That is, to put in place mechanisms that enable the private sector to do more, that allow we the people to do more. The government should be an enabler, not a provider necessarily of end-user services. So I'm going to come back to that idea. But I want to talk about these two sides of government as a platform, because the first side is one that is already well underway, and that is where the government can leverage the power of existing platforms, Web 2.0 platforms, open source platforms, to reduce costs, increase the impact of what they're doing. The bigger, harder challenge that we're taking on is actually to get government agencies at all levels to think like a platform provider, not an application provider. I think there's a unique teachable moment because of the iPhone. And again, we've had previous platforms like the PC or the World Wide Web, but the iPhone is happening right now, and Android phones hot on their heels. And in this, we see this revolution that's hitting the smartphone market. Because it used to be that phones got built kind of the way government does procurement. You get your buddies in a room, you put out a solicitation, you pick the best partners, you deliver this finished product, and it either works or it doesn't. But Apple did something different with the iPhone. Yes, they built that phone. They did a good job of it. They had some revolutionary features. But the real revolution started when they created the iPhone platform and opened for the first time a mobile phone in a really significant way to third-party developers. So we see this magic. Apple wrote something like 15 or 20 applications for their phone. But now, magically, a couple of years later, there's 185,000 applications for the iPhone, and growing by thousands more every week. And that is the magic of platforms. So it seemed to me, as I said, that there's this teachable moment to work with government agencies to say, hey, let's start thinking like that. What kinds of things do we do that have this multiplication effect, where we're designing capabilities that the private sector can build on, rather than simply building complete finished solutions. But before I get there, I want to sort of talk a little bit about the evolution of how government agencies are using existing platforms, because there's a lot of leverage there as well. So, you know, first of all, we see big announcements that are very exciting to the community, the tech communities involved. You know, for example, when whitehouse.gov got moved to Drupal, everybody in the Drupal community was, you know, over the moon, because it was a validation of their technology. But it was also a step, a small step, towards the government saying, wow, we don't have to build this stuff. Drupal already exists. There's already a good content management system. And this is true across government. I think we have a lot of opportunity to bring platforms from open source, from cloud computing, from Web 2.0 into a state where they can be used by government. We certainly see government embracing social media. You know, White House on Facebook, on YouTube. Even recently starting to use SlideShare. And again, this is great because the government is not doing a big procurement to use these technologies. What was really interesting was that they actually had to do a little bit of work, which I think was pioneered by working with YouTube, to come up with terms of service that would allow government agencies to use these features. And even now, when you go on the YouTube channel or the Facebook channel, there's a little notice off to the side saying, hey, you know, this is the White House by the Presidential Records Act. We have to keep a record of all this stuff, and you are being recorded. So there are differences with the way that government has to engage, and it really takes some forward-thinking work by people in government to start to figure out how to use these platforms. There's also resistance. There are existing players who want to continue to sell the government lots of software for problems that are already solved. Now, my response to that is there are a lot of unsolved problems. Let's spend the government's money on problems that are hard and that we don't have off-the-shelf solutions for, and start using this stuff in the same way that government was able to adopt PCs as off-the-shelf software without procurement. But there's a huge I think, revolution that we need to move forward to make it easier and easier for government to use these Web 2.0 and cloud technologies as if they were simply common off-the-shelf software that could be used without procurement. Just like you or I can say, oh yeah, let's use Gmail, or let's use Google Docs, or let's use Zoho, or let's use SlideShare. We don't actually have to get permission, we don't have to buy it, and the government shouldn't either. So that's one of the big steps forward. But you know, a lot of the use of social media by government is really not that interesting. It looks a lot like the way they use TV. They're broadcasting. But there are really good signs. First of all, you can, if you're a government official, you can do more than simply say, okay, here is the governor, the secretary, the mayor, you know, doing a press conference. You know, big whoop. Like, I love this one that I found when I was looking at the State of California YouTube channel. Laurel, thanks for the link. And this was a tutorial video on just how to apply for unemployment insurance. And you think about that. There are people for whom video is going to be a heck of a lot more useful and powerful than going to some government website. So there is this better opportunity to teach people. And sure enough, you know, something like 320,000 people have viewed this video versus 4,000 who viewed, some government official doing a press conference. So one of the lessons learned here is government officials use social media really to educate and help your citizens, not just to broadcast your message. Another really interesting sign, I look at the use of, say, Twitter by government, State Department being a great example. And it's kind of fun because you look and you go, wow, they've got 20,000 followers at the State Department. But then you look, Alec J. Ross, who's working at the State Department, has close to 300,000, so does Jared Cohen. And what's really great is you see at the State Department and many, many, many other agencies that the government has actually understood this idea that social media is not about broadcast. It's about conversation. and you'll see the conversations that are happening with these officials. And I was really impressed by the way that the State Department in particular got involved in the Haiti crisis response, engaging with NGOs, engaging with individuals. I was getting, direct messages from Katie Stanton, who's down there in the lower left corner, saying, "Hey, I'm at a Haiti crisis camp in D.C. Can you broadcast that we need some more Drupal programmers here?" It was like they were in conversation. They were not, I'm a high mucky government official broadcasting to you. They've learned how to use these tools to be part of the community. And this Haiti crisis response thing is just an amazing story. I'm not going to tell you this whole story, but I'll put up these slides later and you can follow this link of just how this unfolded. There was a community of NGOs, open source software projects, Web 2.0 technologies that were brought together into an amazing platform. And the State Department was a big supporter. They were part of the group that got the 4636 short code that was used so people could send in messages. This was then all coordinated by a project that was originally started in Kenya called Ushahidi. This was originally used for monitoring election violence, but it's really a platform for correlating information sent in by SMS, by email, by Twitter, whatever source, putting it on a map, putting it on a timeline so it can be coordinated and analyzed. They also worked with OpenStreetMap. Again, this is a map of Port-au-Prince, where they're showing all the kinds of incidents that were sent in. They worked with Mechanical Turk front ends, Samasource and Crowdflower, because a lot of the reports that were coming in were in Creole in Haiti. And they were able to use these Mechanical Turk kind of process to translate the messages. They reached out to the Haitian diaspora community so they could be translated in English so they could be sent on to the various NGOs who could then do the rescue efforts. It was kind of amazing. I talked with Patrick Meyer and Katie Stanton from the State Department at the Twitter conference recently at Chirp. And Patrick said that he had 7,000 pages of chat logs, coordinating all these volunteers. He was telling me how amazing it was that the U.S. Marine Corps was taking direction from this sort of crazy collection of hackers who'd cobbled together this platform. And that platform thinking is continuing. Noel Dickover, who was one of the people who started this group of Crisis Camp, and they're now carrying it forward to something called Crisis Commons. Again, State Department involved. This platform is now being used right now to report on the oil spill. So we see government engaging with the process of building more useful platforms for crowdsourcing for response to disasters. And I think that's just a really wonderful example of platform thinking by government. They realize they don't have to do it all. They can be a supporter, they can be a cheerleader, they can organize people around important goals. So that's really exciting. Also really excited by what's happening with the government's, the federal government's move towards cloud computing. And that's everything from being able to use cloud apps, but also to start to eliminate some of the redundancies in government IT. I was really struck last year when they put out an infrastructure as a service RFP that there was really a set of requirements. Fully, 20% of the requirements were talk to us about what you're going to do to make these clouds interoperable with what's out there in the private sector already, with other government clouds. They're a great example that the government, in this case the GSA, Casey Coleman, under Casey Coleman's leadership, starting to think about how you start to engage with cloud platforms. Biggest and perhaps most public initiative I think of the government is of the federal government is Vivek Kundra's Data.gov initiative, which is really attempting to turn all of the government's data resources into a kind of SDK for developers. Now, it's still in early stages. There's just so much information there, it's a little bit overwhelming, but I think there's some really good work and thinking in moving that towards becoming a data platform. Because of course, so much of Web 2.0 is about data. It's about applications that are built on information. And the government creates, manages, and produces enormous amounts of information that is often locked away, kind of like that crate that gets put into the vast warehouse at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark. And instead, we're starting to unpack that warehouse. Hopefully not the Ark, though. But a good example of how this data.gov as platform work can already be seen in something like weather. Now, despite the fact that a congressman once said, why do we need NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, when we have the Weather Channel, demonstrating that he was dumber than a bag of hammers? The Weather Service produces all this data, satellites, buoys, coordination of data from ships, from volunteers, and then gives a feed, which feeds everybody from weather in Google to specialty sites like iwindsurf.com, where you go there and you say, what are the wind conditions and wave height at this particular point in the bay if you're a windsurfer? This is government as a platform. The government collects, manages, and produces the data. The private sector then builds on it and takes the services all the way out to citizens. So yes, there is a NOAA website, but I don't think most of us go there. So that's the promise of data.gov, that we can do that with more kinds of government data. I'm also really, really impressed by some of the thinking that's happening in the Department of Health and Human Services. Despite what you might have heard about, sort of the Borg, the idea that we're going to basically take all healthcare and it'll be run by the government, the thinking I'm seeing on the ground is amazingly different. The Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT, which is an office that was actually started by George Bush, but got a lot more funding as part of the Recovery Act, has this really ambitious program which is really a good example of platform thinking in how they're trying to approach the medical records problem. It isn't one big monolithic system where everybody exchanges records because it's all the government's healthcare system. They've got two open source software projects that are focused on interchange protocols. One of them is called HHS Connect. That's focused on the sharing of private and secure data between institutions. The other one is called NHIN Direct, and that one's focused on private and secure exchange of healthcare records between physicians. When they refer a patient from one to another, they can send the records along, or patients want to get their own records. So these are both open source projects, minimal by design. And the idea is that it's actually the private sector is going to take these and build these protocols, these exchange standards into whatever their customer-facing systems that they're going to sell to hospitals, medical practices, and so on. And then on top of that, there's literally tens of billions of dollars in the Recovery Act in direct payments to doctors, hospitals, to kind of jumpstart this market. So I think it's going to be really interesting to watch, because where you have things like fuel efficiency standards, that's the government saying, private sector, you must do this or we'll punish you. This is private sector, do this and we'll reward you. But we're also giving you a mechanism to make sure that all of these systems work together. And we also see this at the local level. There's nonprofit initiatives. This one was started by a wonderful nonprofit called Open Plans to sort of standardize web services API for 311 services. That's the kind of stuff that Tom Steinberg was doing back in 2005 around Fix My Street. The thing that's really nice when you have a standard API, applications that are built for one city will work in another city. And this is going to enable a much more of an entrepreneurial opportunity for competition in apps that deliver these kinds of services. But that kind of brings me to the fact that there are startup opportunities here. SeeClickFix, for example, is a startup that is building mobile apps, web apps for people to report, learn about, engage with these kinds of 311 issues, potholes, streetlights that are out, graffiti, whatever it is. And this is a tool for community engagement. There's other startups, crimereports.com, a lot like what Adrian Halavati did with Chicago Crime. But what I really like here is that Greg Weisenot, the guy who started this, is actually working with police departments, because he realizes that the consumer-facing part of this is only half of the problem. The back end is, how do I build better tools for police departments to manage that data? And I think he's hit on a really winning combination. Free service for developers, cheap software as a service back end to actually help cities and counties deal with the data, build better systems. So he's delivering a service cheaper, faster, better, building, I think, a significant business in the process. I think he's now in 8,000 police departments across the United States. So there are entrepreneurial opportunities, and I want to say that because part of my goal with my Gov2O advocacy is to get more developers excited about the potential in building civic software. And I define civic software as the software that makes our cities, our states, our counties, our country, our world work better. It's about what we as citizens do to make a better world together. So, because that leads me back to a big part of my thinking about government as platform, and that is that we've gotten on a kind of a terrible, escalating, I guess it's kind of a roller coaster where we're kind of going up, 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 and you know that at some point that roller coaster is going to come down, down, down very fast. And you look at the percent of government spending as a percent of GDP in the U.S. This is a truly scary chart. And we've got to reverse that. And you have, I think, a lot of sentiment, certainly in the U.S. and around the world, that we've got to cut government spending. But I don't think a Tea Party is going to do it. I don't think that simply saying no to everything is going to do it. We have to be smart about how do we get more services for less money. We can't just cut services, because that's what's happening. Governments are saying, oh, we can't do that, no, we can't do that. We have the party of no kind of stuff. We have this endless dialogue, we need more services, no, we can't afford them. And it strikes me that platform thinking is part of the answer. It's not all of the answer, because we need structural reforms of all kinds. But just remember, Apple wrote under 20 applications, they got 185,000. If we really understand and get to the future that is the promise of Gov2O, that is the promise of open government, it isn't just about transparency, it isn't just about social media, it is about solving this graph by using the power of platforms to get more for less. Now, the problem that we have is that we've come to think of government as kind of a vending machine. I got this image from a book called The Next Government of the United States by Donald Kettle, not the graphic itself, but the idea of government as a vending machine. And this is the idea. We put in our taxes, we get out roads and schools and police and fire and hospitals and all this kind of stuff. And it's a fundamentally broken model, particularly when it comes to the idea of citizen participation, because we think that participation means protest. That we basically get to complain when government doesn't do the things that we want, or we want it to do something different, or we don't want it to do something. And that's not sufficient for citizen participation. What we really have to figure out is how to actually make things happen ourselves. So my keystone Gov2O story is one that I read last year. Actually, it was even in 2008. No, sorry, it was April of 2009, when the financial meltdown fears were still going strong. Governments were saying, whoa, we don't have any money. There was a state park in Kauai that was closed due to a road being washed out. They said, we don't have the money to do it. It's going to take 2 years. The local businesses all said, whoa, we can't wait 2 years. This will devastate our economy. So they got together and they fixed the road themselves in an old-fashioned barn raising. Why can't we do that more? We've forgotten that government is a mechanism for collective action. And government should be used to fund the things that we really can't do without some kind of larger collective action. Sorry about that. And so I wrote a blog post about this. I said the change we need is actually DIY on a civic scale. Scott Heiferman, the founder of Meetup, said, no, we don't want DIY. We want DIO. Do it ourselves. John Seeley Brown said to me the other day, he coined a separate one, DIT, do it together. And that's the real promise of Gov 2.0. All of the Web 2.0 platforms, in some sense, are about collective intelligence. They're about collaboration. They're about crowdsourcing. They're about ways that we can gather the power of distributed individuals, distributed communities, and bring them together. And I really want to remind you that that is the promise. So I really love Scott's thing about Meetup. And I was just the other day Googling to see how many meetups there were around that used the word community. And there's something like 565,000. Now, some of them are things like I see here, the top list is the Columbia Venture Community and the London Java Community. But a lot of them are really around civic purposes. San Francisco Online Community Meetup, Community Gardens Meetup, Transition to Green Community, Latina Community Meetup, Community Building Meetup, Community Builders Meetup. This is all people self-organizing, using a Web 2.0 platform to get together for their own purposes to help build a better society. And that, of course, is what we're focusing on, the DIY side with our own efforts around MAKE. We did a Remake America issue looking at how DIY can help with manufacturing, transportation, food and water, renewable energy. There is a lot more we can do ourselves. It's also why we're taking our Maker Fair to Detroit, because we said this shouldn't just be for yuppies in the Bay Area, you know, or New York, where we're also taking it. Let's go somewhere that's challenged, and let's see if we can get that entrepreneurial, do-it-yourself spirit going in a challenged community. So I'm really excited about that. Again, this comes back to Gov 2.0, is how do we use the power of these platforms to get people to work together on common goals again. I want to sort of end here with an appeal, particularly around a nonprofit that I'm on the board of, that I'm very excited about. It's called Code for America. Started by Jen Palka, who worked with me on my Web 2.0 events and helped launch the first Gov 2.0 event before getting inspired herself and quitting her job, much to my chagrin, to start this nonprofit with the goal of actually building civic software for cities. It's loosely modeled on Teach for America. Their idea is to get fellows who will go work with selected cities for a year to build software that will then be made open source and available to other cities, so that we can start to bring the power of the Web 2.0 community, the iPhone developer community, the Android developer community, social media community, to work on civic problems. Now, there's a lot we're doing in Washington, but there's an awful lot that can be done on the local level, because in the end, Gov 2.0 starts at that local level. And we're going to be looking for fellows to spend a year. So we're just starting to gear up to that recruitment. We just announced our first 5 cities that we're going to be working with, which are Washington, D.C., Boston, Philadelphia, Seattle, and Boulder. But we are going to be recruiting, and I hope that some of you will be willing to join us, because, as you know, I've been urging developers who have been, perhaps sort of hoping just to make a buck, to start thinking instead about how to work on stuff that matters. I think that rebuilding our institutions, rebuilding our collective will, rebuilding our collective ability to build a better society is one of those things that matters, and I hope that you will be part of that. Thank you. I'm now ready for questions. All right, I'm looking at the first question. It says, government as a platform allows private investment to build services upon this platform. How would you say you can favor equity when the private sector tends to target clients with more money to spend? That's a good question, and I don't know that there's a simple answer, because every marketplace, based economy, has these two sides. And that is one side where we have empirical evidence that marketplaces do raise the economic floor for everyone. The Western economies are good places to live, and the harnessing that capitalist impulse really works. At the same time, we see these incredible excesses, you know, most recently in the Wall Street meltdown, with just incredible greed. And you know, all I can say there is we have to remember, against part of rediscovering that civic spirit, that says, no, wait, we don't basically steal from our society. We don't put our private gain ahead of, you know, we don't rip off our customers. And so, you know, there's this motto that we use at O'Reilly that was originally coined by Brian Irwin, which I love so much, which is create more value than you capture. As long as you're building value for society more than you're building value for yourself, it's great that you build value for yourself along the way. So next question. How about the technology gap in government? How does this affect the effectiveness of Gov 2.0? Well, I think that is a big part of what we're trying to address. You know, there is, remember when Vivek Kundra, the federal CIO, was working on his last presentation to Congress, and we were kind of looking at his slides, and he was just looking at, that was where he started, was with the gap. You know, the private sector has, you know, iPhone apps with situational awareness. That's the envy of stuff in the military, and they got it for nothing, you know, next to nothing, because of this dynamic private sector. Meanwhile, we're spending, you know, tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to build stuff that will be 5 or 7 years out of date. This is why we need to reform procurement. Mary Davey, who's going to be speaking at our Gov 2 Expo, is sort of focused on this. She has a better government initiative specifically around procurement, and there's a lot to be solved there. There's no question that government processes, actually as are the processes at many large institutions, are behind the curve. And a lot of what we are trying to do here is to accelerate government's growth along that curve, to get caught up faster with these new technologies. I don't think that it's going to happen all at once, but we can make it, if we make it even a little bit better, we're making an impact. And we do that really, again, with the events, we're trying to do it simply by making heroes out of the people who are out on the front of the curve, so that they're not shot down by the people in their big organizations who are threatened. And we see that, you know, so we can celebrate the forward-looking groups, like the way Secretary Clinton is supporting Jared Cohen and Alec Ross and Katie Stanton at State to go out there and do amazing stuff with these new platforms. So what innovations would we like to see our state government providing? More, better, or especially completely new? Well, I think there's a number of things that I'd love to see at the state level. The first and probably most important is I'd love to see more code sharing between states, also between cities. And as I say, that's part of what we're trying to tackle with Code for America. You know, when you think about it, we have these enormous budget deficits, and yet every state is doing virtually the same thing and paying for it again and again and again. Every state has to have a division of motor vehicles or equivalent, right? Why are they not sharing their code? There's a big lesson there from open source. There's even worse things when you dig down into it. And some of this has to do with micromanagement by Congress. Now, if you're an entrepreneur, you know how helpful a board of directors can be. But you also know that you can also be micromanaged by a board of directors. Now imagine that the federal government is a company with a 535-person board of directors that is very, very intrusive. So they'd say things like, hey, you know, Department of Agriculture, you manage food stamps. You know, HHS, you manage Medicare. And guess what? Out there in the states where there's actually the local offices, they've got to have IT infrastructure for managing that stuff. And wouldn't it be nice if there was a shared infrastructure, you know, say cloud computing or the shared data center? Well, it turns out that Congress has actually mandated, no, you cannot pool funds between these different agencies. You know, so whoa, we've got to actually go back and fix stuff like that so that that government agencies can take advantage of some of the cost savings that are implicit in these new technologies. When we move to cloud, we're going to have to be able to have shared infrastructure. And that's not a technical problem. It may be a policy problem. Just like the policy problem that got solved in order to allow the White House to use YouTube. You know, there had to be some changes. There had to be some accommodations on both sides to come up with new policies. So there's a lot of policy work here. Next question. Oh, well, so actually, let me just say a bit more on the state level. The other thing I think that's really important on the state level is because big institutions don't go away easily, I think we need a lot of fresh thinking about how they can reinvent their mission. You know, so for example, state libraries. You know, they're incredible gathering places. You know, certainly the availability of information via books is important. But I heard an amazing story recently from the new Surgeon General of the United States in a talk she gave at the Mass Health IT conference where I was moderating a panel. She talked about a situation, I think it was in rural Alabama, where somebody was without a phone. She said, you know, it was like she was, before she became Surgeon General, she was a physician there. And she said, but you can reach me by email. This was somebody living out in the middle of nowhere, no phone service. But they said, I can get email at the library. And that kind of leapfrog that is possible. I think libraries are really important. This kind of leads into the next question, which was what can non-technologists do to promote Gov2O and online open gov initiatives? Asking it as a former GovDocs librarian. I think that a big part of what you can do is find new uses for the places, the institutions. Push your government officials to work with you. Be engaged. Find ways to be engaged. And of course, if you're on the government side, you want to find ways to engage with the people who care. There are so many different kinds of projects, for example, that government could be organizing meetups around to try to actually get those concerned citizens on board. There are, a lot of things that can be done around communications. How do we actually improve the ability of people to learn about what's happening in government, to care about it? I think, the most important thing that we can do as citizens is to care about our communities and to care about all the small ways that we can make them better. We can look hard problems in the eye. And there are so many hard problems. I thought there was a really interesting article I just read this morning about how Youngstown, Ohio, back in 2002, started to confront the fact that the city was shrinking in a way that other cities have not. And they were able, by being realistic about where their city was going, they were really able to change their planning processes. And this is something that citizens can get involved with. You can get involved at the neighborhood level. You can get involved at the city level. And the tools that we have today can amplify your voice. They can amplify your ability to organize groups of people. And this goes back to the Alpha Geeks thing. Linus Torvalds was just this kid in Finland. He started building something. He put it out for free. He sort of attracted a different attention. He started working with people around the world, and he created this, phenomenon that changed the world. Tim Berners-Lee put out his web server for free, changed the world. There's amazing leverage in the internet, and activists who aren't necessarily technical can use those platforms as well to gain support. There's something like 26 million active members on Facebook causes. Use tools like this for your civic purposes. So next question. Speaking of communities, am I defining Gov2O as the same as open government? As are non-tech aspects still Gov2O? I think that I'm a word guy, and every time there's a different word, it means something slightly different. That's the beauty of language. But words occur in clusters, and they point in clouds towards interesting concepts. And open government, everything from, as you say, town hall meetings to government transparency, is a really, really important part of this movement. by the way, I didn't give a shout out to this, but I really want, if there's anybody who has influence over national news media, the Sunlight Foundation did the most amazing thing on the transparency front during the healthcare bill. They streamed the C-SPAN video, and while each senator was speaking, they showed, they did face recognition, identified who it was, and they showed the top campaign contributors to that senator while they were speaking. And that's just innovations like that, just super sweet on the open government front. But that is also Gov2O, because they are using technology. And I think of Gov2O, I think it's like, hey, how can we put to work the very best practices of the Web 2.0 and cutting edge technology to work on the problems of government. But I think there's also, you can cast as big a net as you can or want, as long as you're making important stuff happen. I'm happy with it. Okay, so next question. If you build it, they will come doesn't always apply. A platform with no users or activities provides little value. What are the ingredients that increase participation and the likelihood of success? Really good question. And I think that is actually one of the very first things that we need to think about in this Gov2 context. It's just what exists already. And that's why I started with existing platforms. I realized there was a bit of a flaw in the way I was talking about government as a platform last year, because I was talking about building, adopting, creating this new stuff for government. But reuse is such a key part of it. Because, and actually I was talking with Ev Williams about Code for America recently, and that was his pushback. He says, what's going to make this not just be yet another piece of government software? What's going to drive adoption? Brad Burnham at Union Square Ventures, same thing. He was like, okay, how do we, how do we get away from this shelfware? And part of what we do is we leverage existing platforms that already have traction. So I'm working with the Department of Health and Human Services on some open government data initiatives, and a big part of what we're doing is saying, how do we get this data into existing software that already has adoption? Not just how do we get this data and build some new app which may just sit on the shelf and not get very many users. But that being said, every startup faces that challenge. Some of them get users, some of them don't. And I don't think we should be holding government to a higher standard. It's really important. I was talking with a city official in Boston recently, and they were worried that they're going to get pilloried because they built some app that cost them $10,000, and somebody is going to be making political hay over it, particularly if it doesn't work. And yet if you're in the startup community, that things that don't work are how you learn. And we have to let government make mistakes, learn quickly, and move on. And of course, that kind of learning, the lean startup, that's why we're bringing, for example, lean startup. Eric Rees and his lean startup message is part of our Gov2 Expo, because we're trying to get that thinking into government. It's very foreign to how we think about it today, but it's certainly what we need to think about going forward. Now, we have a last question. How do we in government break down the barriers to implementation to these initiatives? Boy, that's a tough one. And I have to say, those of you in government are far more aware of the barriers and the challenges than I am. I do know that there is terrific support at the top of many government agencies, many organizations. There's terrific innovation bubbling up from technologists and people on the ground throughout the organization. And there's often, when I learned this new term when I was in DC last year, it was the clay layer. By analogy with the layer of clay that the water can't percolate through either from the top or bubble up from the bottom. And sometimes in an organization it's just tough, big organizations. And it is why government is harder than the private sector. If you have a big, stuck private sector organization, some entrepreneur routes around them and kicks their butt and in the marketplace, and they've got to learn or they die. Whereas government is in kind of a privileged position. So I think what I'm trying to do simply is to celebrate the heroes, celebrate the successes, tell big stories, share the lessons. I think networking with other people who are innovating. For example, I recently introduced somebody at the Department of Treasury with somebody from the Department of Health and Human Services, because I thought that their problems looked kind of similar. and the guy at HHS had learned something that the Treasury guy could apply. I think, you know, it's a hard problem. We're not going to solve it all. But there's this wonderful quote from Pope John Paul II, at least I heard it attributed to him, that I really love, which is, see everything, ignore a lot, improve a little. And you guys, if you've been to my talks, you probably heard me, you know, quote from that fabulous Rilke poem, The Man Watching, in which he talks about Jacob wrestling with the angel and coming away strengthened from the fight. And it ends with this just fabulous passage where he says, what we fight with is so small, and when we win, it makes us small. What we want is to be defeated decisively by successively greater beings. Now, I can think of nothing better than tackling a big, hard problem, making some progress, and losing. It's so much better than doing something trivial and retiring rich. And I just kind of just urge you, you know, the challenge of Gov2O is, you know, to remake our institutions, to take back the power that we had. Think back to the beginnings of this country. Think back to the beginnings of modern democracies. These were empowered individuals coming together to think and work and put their lives on the line, literally, to make a better world. We see that, you know, in repressive regimes today. People are putting their very lives on the line. Can we do less? We need to rise to the occasion. We need to take on the challenge. And I think there's a wonderful opportunity for us all and individually to make a difference. Thank you.